So I know a lot of people on my channel are here for the comic book reviews. They're not necessarily interested in the book stuff or other subjects. But don't worry, I got a comic book video coming along alongside this one. Just finished this book last night. Been reading it for a little while. It's called Asia's Reckoning. It's by Richard McGregor. He also wrote famously The Party, which is sort of the seminal text on how the Communist Party of China operates. It's getting a little bit dated because I believe it came out in like 2009, 2010. So, the book just makes passing references to Xi Jinping as he was about the time the book was written, he was the head of the main party sort of college slash school slash cadre school in Shanghai. And, it talks a little bit about his elevation to the Politburo Standing Committee. So this book, though, came out, I believe, last year. It's about the trilateral relationship between China, the United States, and Japan. So I was obviously a lot more familiar with the China and, of course, the U.S. side, as I'm an American and I live in the United States. I visited Japan. I know quite a bit about Japan, but I don't know a lot about Japanese politics. So that's where most of the stuff that really interests me and the stuff that I learned most from this book. So I wrote down on a note card over here some talking points about this. So some of the things that I didn't know that I thought were really interesting is there have been a ton of Japanese prime ministers. So the thing that's always quoted in the news is the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the political party that's in power right now in Japan, has ruled Japan for almost its entire post-war history. There's like I want to say it's like a 6-year thing where the left-wing party had it, but the left-wing party had 3 different prime ministers in a row, and they didn't rule for that long. So the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, has ruled Japan for a very long time, but it has a ton of prime ministers. So people would come in, they would get removed, they would resign, blah, blah, blah. They get pulled from power and stuff like that. But the political party would stay in power, but, the prime minister would turn over. And the turnover rate on some of these prime ministers is like a few months. So being an American, that's really, really odd. And again, I'm really familiar with the idea that the Liberal Democratic Party has ruled Japan, for the vast majority of the post-war period. And you'll hear that on news reports all the time when they talk about the current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe or whatever. They'll be like, the LDP has ruled Japan for, however many years out of the year since 1945, but they never mentioned just how many prime ministers there were. I looked it up on Wikipedia, and you know how they have like the charts on Wikipedia where they have like a length of time it'll be, and it just looks like a stair step going down because everyone's time in office is so tiny. The next thing I really didn't know 100% about was Chinese attitudes toward the Japanese post-war, especially like the Chinese ruling elite. So they were really conciliatory towards the Japanese, and today when you see how the Communist Party treats it, and young Chinese people and old Chinese people within China are just inundated with propaganda about the war. They're just hit over the head with it night and day, and that wasn't always the case. Mao Zedong once, according to this book, and I believe it's true because I really like this author and he's super reliable, and this is a well-researched book and I recommend it. But Mao Zedong once told, can't remember which Japanese prime minister, but he told one of them, thank you, because we wouldn't be in power if it wasn't for the Japanese, because the Japanese engaged the nationalists, the Chinese retreated, and only sort of came about after the war, after they had retreated to Yan'an and gotten their foothold. And sort of the last thing I really want to talk about is this book does a really good job of examining how nationalism against Japan, and to a lesser extent the United States, is sort of a double-edged sword for the Chinese Communist Party. So, young kids, especially in the post-Tiananmen era, are fed a steady diet of anti-Japanese, anti-quote-unquote Western, I hate the term Western, but anti-Western propaganda in China. There's, all these I forget the exact term they use, but like national patriotic education, I believe is what it's called. But national patriotic education campaigns to teach them that the Japanese were terrible during the war, they're the enemy, they need to constantly forgive China, blah blah blah, and that's really a double-edged sword for the Communist Party, because in all of its dealings with Japan, it now, the Communist Party doesn't want to look soft. So even when it's probably in the country's best interest, or even the Communist Party's best interest, they sometimes have to walk a fine line because they're afraid of being damned by the population, who can be hypersensitive and hyper-nationalistic to these things. And I thought this book did a wonderful job of explaining that concept, why it's that way, and situations where it's of note. So an example it gives is the current Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who's just as famous for his eyebrows as he is for anything else. But he's the current foreign minister, and he the other day he got elevated to some, let's just call it foreign minister plus position. But he's really powerful within China. But he cut his teeth being China's foremost Japanese expert, and the Japanese apparently considered him, a real shark, because he would go after them with all hands on deck. And the sort of analysis with the situation was, because he is a Japanese expert and speaks Japanese so well and has all these dealings and focusing with the Japanese, he can't look soft. If he wanted to continue his climb up the party ladder, which he did, he in his dealings with the Japanese, he needed to be extra firm and extra assertive. So these were all really, really fascinating things. The first half of the book, or a little more than the first half of the book, is about the history. So sort of, I would say like I want to say it starts around the first Sino-Japanese War, but I think it might be even a little earlier than that. But it examines that history all the way up to the present day. And even, like, this book is really recent, so even like the post-Trump election. And then the second half is sort of all analysis about how that plays out in current day and about how that affects things. So if you're not as interested in history stuff, which honestly I'm not as interested in the history stuff, but if you're not as interested in the history stuff, just read the second half of the book, because I still think it's worth it. It's so current. This is the best text you're ever going to find on the trilateral relationship between these three countries. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. And if you're interested in the history, again, I didn't know a lot about Japanese political history post-World War II, so this was an extremely enlightening book. And the Chinese stuff, too, is also good if you're unfamiliar with it. But if you really want to do the deep dive into the Communist Party and its rule within China, check out his other book, which is plugged down here, The Party. And it'll give you a little bit of the peek behind the curtain of what's known as the Chinese black box of government. So yeah, this is a definite recommend. Love this book. Anybody who's really interested in politics, whether they're interested in Asia or not, should read this book, because this is, of any kind of three-way relationship between countries, this is right now the most important on earth and will be for the foreseeable future. So when I was in college, everybody was obsessed with Europe, and I want to study history focusing on Europe. I want to study politics focusing on Europe. Everyone should have been looking. It's kind of funny to say this, but it's west for us. But metaphorically, should have been looking east. So yeah, definitely pick this up. And if you're here for the comics, I'm glad you stayed. I appreciate that. My ratio of comic book to normal book discussions and reviews is like 6-to-1. So don't tune out. Got a comic book video coming up for you, and hope you enjoyed this. Like, comment, and subscribe. What are your favorite books about China? What are your favorite books about Japan? Which one kind of piques your interest a little more? I know, Japanese culture played a big role in my childhood. I mean, who didn't love Pokemon back in the day? So yeah. Yeah, definitely check this book out, though. It's one of the best books I've read this year, certainly.